Hi, my beautiful one.
Hello, how are you?
Um, Today I'm feeling good.
Hmm.
I've had like good days and bad days, which I feel
No,
like
agreed.
everyone has had.
Absolutely. It's been such a communal experience
Yeah,
of, I think, just what we're collectively going through and just trying to figure out like the action that's being taken is inspiring, and at the same time, there's a heaviness to the fact that we're in this position in the first place.
yeah. And I think that honestly, without realizing it, the first couple of months of just being in quarantine and dealing with everything that was happening was gearing us up to understanding that we are in most experiences together and that we can only get through them together. And
Hmm.
I think that that is really important for the conversation that we're having because you tell me what you think, but from my perspective, I've realized that I think before the last couple of weeks, when you brought
Hmm.
up the term social justice, it was a very singular category. It was something that people felt like you had to be a part of that because if you were going to a very specific cause. And I am more and more realizing that people are waking up to the fact that that social justice causes affect all of us, and for us to fight for social justice, it means we are fighting for ourselves as well and for our
Hmm.
freedom and our equality. And so today I wanted to talk to you about what it means to make that commitment to social justice, and what it means on a level, like a daily level. And I
Hmm.
was talking to a good friend of both of ours, Elaine Welteroth, about how
Yes.
um, like we need to be able to add social justice to our vision boards when we're making daily goals, weekly goals, monthly goals, like having our friends hold us accountable. What are we doing for these causes? So
Hmm.
how have you reframed your mindset around what social justice looks like after the last couple of weeks?
Right. Well, I think social justice, there's always been a dialogue in my family about what it means to be caring about our communities. I know when we first met, what now almost 2 years ago,
Yeah.
I think that was a moment where we instantly connected just because we had always been a part of families where this was central to how we operate. But I think when I'm looking at the events of the past couple weeks, there are certain things that really become more obvious in that it does have to become a daily practice. And I think for many people, just the way that, whether it be the way social media is structured, the way our lives are structured, there are these moments in which we rally together. And then if you are not of the community affected, it's okay to then go back to your life and then just kind of be prepared when the next thing happens. But I think what this moment and movement is proving is that there's a level of responsibility, whether your commitment to social justice is self-educating every day, is making sure that you know the specificities of the community that you're fighting for. I think
Mhm.
um, we're both part of communities in which I think it's an expectation if you're of any sort of minority that you know the dominant culture inside and out. And we talk about this all the time, just
Yeah.
for the sake of survival. Like you know everything about how they operate, but that reciprocity isn't there. And so I think even if you're here actively advocating for the Black community, brown communities, whatever communities they may be, it's also important to be in that position of how do I educate myself based on what the people on the front lines are saying, based on what the people in the communities are saying. And those are things that sound really grand, but can be broken down into feasible everyday tasks.
Absolutely. And it's so funny because from a journalistic perspective, and I know we've talked about this, the question that I always ask myself before I go into telling a story of a community that I'm not as familiar with is how is the way that we cover this going to impact the community that we're talking about? And we've seen
Absolutely.
how big media representation of communities impacts how other people treat members of those communities. And so there's such power in story, and that isn't just the stories that we are telling, but it's the stories we are consuming. So one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that I feel like is, which is what you said, is it self-educating every day and realizing whose stories are we learning about these stories from firsthand experiences, or are we only
Mm-hmm.
learning about them from Twitter threads of political commentators?
Right.
And for you, I know that reading is a huge part of your life, and it's how you've like educated yourself. And also, I mean, you've been posting about book recommendations all the
Hmm.
time. How do you like, how should people go about where to even begin when it comes
Hmm.
to making a commitment to social justice as a whole? Do you start at specific communities, or do you start understanding what it does when it's like how social justice serves you as well?
Right. I think there are different entry points for people. I think oftentimes people do need that touch point to understand how a certain cause affects them in order to create that bond. But I don't think there's anything wrong with starting out specific. I feel like, if anything, it can only help the communities that you're in allyship with. Um, just because I think oftentimes what happens, especially as somebody where like I'm proudly Black and Iranian, but in the media sphere, oftentimes the first question when you're telling any story is how do you make this universal?
Right.
And I understand the instinct to do that, but I do think to a certain extent something is lost if that's your first instinct, rather than believing that if you engage in the specificity of what you're telling, people will find their connection to it. And so I think
Yeah.
um, it's important to be okay feeling like you can't relate for a moment. That shouldn't stop you from engaging, because I promise you, down the line, you will find that touch point that hits close to home. But either way, I think it's important for an entire, I think what we're witnessing right now, it's important to create a sense of empathy that may have to be developed. I know so many people are looking at the Black community for the first time and seeing their family within this community, seeing
Mm,
their friends within this community. And I think that comes from this idea of if you can't immediately relate, then you're detached or out of it, versus it's a learned skill for so many people. And you have to continue learning it. And I think there's two things that you can do too in terms of that first touch point of how you engage. There's what you can do on a personal level, which is self-educate. I love doing like some digging to see what are the interesting ways that I can be of service. What are the things that only I can offer in this moment? Because we're not all supposed to be doing the same thing. We're supposed to be doing, I think, things that represent our plethora of skills,
yeah.
resources, and abilities, which is what makes these movements so effective, is that you see people giving in any way they possibly can and in ways that only they can.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's also so many of us are a part of larger groups. And so a big part of engaging in social justice is how are you bringing that mentality into these larger groups? I know for me, I work with many a corporation. And some of our first questions are, one, just as a company, what are your own philanthropic commitments? And like, what are the commitments of whether it be the brand, the corporation, the agency? And then the next question is like, okay, well, this is what matters to me. How are we going to align these? How
Yeah.
are we going to bring these together? Because I think that's an important and easy way to quickly spread the message of one individual into the mission statement of many people.
I love that so much, because that's something similarly like we have the same conversations with the brands and the corporations that we choose to work with. And I think that part of what excites me about what's happening, kind of the reckoning that's happening right now, is that
Hmm.
because everybody has released the statement that they have, even if they don't mean it, even if it's not entirely genuine, when you reach out to people, now it's on us to hold people accountable and say, okay, well, this is what you posted. I want to know exactly what you have done since then towards
Right,
this, because we need to know that you're about your mission and you're about it. And if we're not going to hold people accountable, then who is? And
right.
that is our responsibility. But I also love what you said about people doing what they can to be of service, because I just saw this, and I'll post it and credit the person who came up with this, but there was this chart of an ecosystem, and it
Hmm.
was like storytellers, builders, like gatherers, and it was so many different things, and you get to choose like what role do you play in this ecosystem. And the first feeling that I had when I saw that was I was overwhelmed with just like, whoa, I feel so much better, because because the responsibility isn't entirely on one person. Like, you just have to play the role that you want to play that is the most natural to you. I saw
Mm-hmm.
storyteller on there, and I got so excited, and I was like, wait, that's what I'm, so that means that I'm like, I'm doing my part, I'm playing my role, like, amazing. But guess what? That means there are so many other people out there who are utilizing their skills and their passions and their causes to create this entire ecosystem. And if we can find ourselves in this ecosystem, then it makes this
Mm-hmm.
commitment so much easier. And I'm sure that you've heard this, but what is your response when you get people telling you or sharing with you how overwhelmed they feel, and how
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the feeling of being overwhelmed is paralyzing, and it makes people just not do anything at all?
Yeah, well, I kind of have broken it down into two categories because I think you and I both have been in conversation with so many people, whether it be people that are currently on the front lines. I know
Mm-hmm.
our dear friend Patrice, or people where it's like, okay, you are in a position of being an active ally right now, or whatever that position may be. And I think the way I've divided it, particularly at this moment, is that um, if you're of the Black community right now, it's okay to take a breath because I know the conversation has been happening, but when you go through this moment of either communal trauma, moments like this, sometimes you do need to take a moment. Sometimes right now isn't your moment to be active. If you do have the ability to be active, if you are able to be active, then it is finding what that first step looks like. If you have the easiest one is, okay, if you have monetary resources, here are the funds and foundations to turn to. And what's great about I think the donation process is that's still an easy way to first turn to the people on the front lines to say, okay, what are you saying I should pour my money into? What are
Right.
you saying I should pour my resources into? But then in terms of other touch points, just like you're saying about the flow chart, I think it is important to be like, well, where does my skill set lie? It may be something surprising. It may be something that you thought was seemingly small that is super significant. I mean, I love seeing one of my little cousin is an amazing artist. And the one thing that she's doing that I just thought was so cool was she was saying, hey, to her peers, if anyone donates 20 or more dollars to an organization, send me your receipt and I'll make you a portrait. And it was a really cool way to inspire people
Wow.
to be in the process of donating. But this is something that she came up with just by looking at her platform, her skill sets. And I've been seeing that everywhere. And so a lot of becoming socially engaged is looking at what people are already doing, because I'm sure there is a source of inspiration. And then I think for the people that are in the positions of being allies, I understand that this is a moment that is overwhelming for them too, but I think it's important to be on the front lines of having those tough conversations.
Yep.
Um, I can attest to the fact that I've gotten plenty of well-meaning and lovely texts reaching out, but also being like, what in the world should I do? And there are times in which I have the space to answer them and help and break it down. And there are other times where it's like, this would be really helpful if you had a conversation with your friend who are both allies and tried to figure something out. It'd be
Yeah.
helpful if this was a daily practice in your circles that didn't include brown people. So that when you come to us, you're coming to us with plans, with intentions,
Yeah.
versus this kind of turning to be like, what do I do?
Yeah. I mean, I
Guide
think
me, where
that
do I start?
that has been uh, a huge like learning curve for so many people of sending message, like, and we've had so many conversations with like various Black friends who have just shared their exhaustion with us of like how many people out of nowhere came to them and was just like can you just help this one person that I know, like I know you would be able to get through to them. And it's just like, that's not that person's responsibility. It's not
Right.
their responsibility to teach these people. And so even when you were saying like your initial response being that, like, take a breather, take a breath, and take a break is so important, because a friend of mine, Vera Papisova, was telling me about this a few weeks ago before all of this happened. And
Mm-hmm.
she was talking about the importance of being an upstander versus a bystander, which
Mm-hmm.
I loved the terminology and I loved the concept.
Yeah.
But basically, she was saying how, like, when somebody goes through a trauma or an abuse, it should not it is not their responsibility to become advocates or activists for themselves. Their
Mm-hmm.
responsibility is to heal and to go through the process that they need to go through to heal and to protect themselves. And everybody around who is familiar with the situation, it's on them to be an upstander and to speak up and to say something and to fight for the protection and the equality of that person. And it was such a like light bulb moment to me, because I realized how many people on the front lines do we know who are dealing with like such deep trauma that hasn't been taken care of or healed. Like, that's why so many activists and organizers and leaders are exhausted, because they don't get the
Absolutely.
chance to like take care of themselves the way that they need to. And it's our responsibility, it's on us who are allies, to stand up and be like, hey, how can I carry this with you? How can I be
Mm-hmm.
to you? How can I make sure that you are not going through all of this pain alone, and that I can help alleviate some of this? And I think that's where that daily commitment comes in place, because the only way you'll be able to do that is to consistently self-educate yourself. And the only way that you're able to do that is to make sure that you realize that this moment in time isn't a trend, it's a commitment.
Mm-hmm.
Once you've posted, once you've said something, once you've made that commitment, it's on us to continue.
Right. And I mean, I wonder, I think for you, we've talked about your work in the past, which is many times dealt with communities that you may not be a part of. And so, what is your first touch point when you're entering these communities? What is it that pushes you to make that commitment? Because I think you've done, so, I mean, always such a beautiful job of centering people's stories, regardless of the overt or obvious connections.
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you so much. I think that the way that I learned about this was, it's funny, because when I first started working in television, when I first started reporting, I thought that like the hardest part of my job was going to be getting a job in television wearing a hijab, but the hardest
Mm-hmm.
part was actually building trust with people who were going to like be okay with a camera in your face and trust that you weren't going to take their story and run with it. And so my immediate entry point was, I always had pre-interviews and conversations with people, like completely casual, off topic, just to get to know them as people. And I developed this skill where I was able to quickly pinpoint like how I would be able to relate to them. And
Mm-hmm.
I may have shared this story with you, but for the context of like people who are watching, when I was working on the documentary on sex workers and the sex trade, one of the sex workers was a trans woman sex worker that I was interviewing had written a piece on how she related to Muslim women who wear the hijab, because society was obsessed with the way that we dressed. And so we had a good conversation about like
Mm-hmm.
like choosing to dress the way that we wanted to. And that was our entry point. And we were like, yeah, we both know what that feels like. Now let's talk about this.
Right.
Then sometimes it's a lot harder. I remember one time I did a story on a guy who was a tattoo artist who was removing gang related and like racist tattoos off of people who wanted to start fresh. And the guy that I was interviewing who's getting the tattoo removed he was like a white guy in this tank top, and he like did not want to talk, did not want to like. I was so nervous, and I was really in my head a lot. And so I I had this conversation with him off camera, and I was just talking to him like, yeah, like how has it made you feel, or like what are some of the things that you've gone through?
Mm-hmm.
People have seen this tattoo. And he looked at me and he was like, there was this guy that I used to work with who was Muslim, and I used to joke around calling him a terrorist, and he used to joke around calling me a white supremacist, and we got along just fine. And I was like, that's going to be my entry point today. That right there is going to be my entry point. And it's like not going to always be a buddy like connection, but he told me his story and he opened up and he trusted me because I came in as myself and I like created conversation. And I think that if we open our minds and our hearts to people, you realize that everybody wants the same thing. He wanted to protect
Mm-hmm.
his family. He wanted to protect himself. He wanted to like maintain his job and keep his health and all of these things. We all want the same things. So that should be like the least common denominator should always be the fact that we want the same things, and you have to be able to find one of those. And then from there, if you can continue moving and grow even for like,
Hmm.
if you're into sports and you like the same sports team, and these are two people who would have never had a conversation, but sports seems to be the thing that like people really bond over, you have that point of connection, and it is fragile and it can go away, but if you build on it, it can be something incredibly strong. And I think that
Yeah.
now with what we are doing with making this commitment overall, it's so important to realize that at the end of the day, we all want the same things and we all want it for ourselves. And if we want the same thing for others, it can only enhance our ability to grow in that as well.
Hmm. Absolutely, which is, I think, why reading in history has become such a big deal to me because the way that I've been raised, the way our household operates, is that my parents have always placed us within a larger global community. And so there's always been an explanation of how things happening around the world have inherently, directly or indirectly, affected us, affected the freedoms that we get to experience. And so it's always been that idea of when there's a movement anywhere in the world that is fighting for freedom, it is a movement that we should be in support of. Um, but it also means that there's just this feeling of connectivity between us and the rest of the world. And when I'm looking at, like, my obsession is how we teach history. And I think we may have talked about this before, but the reason why it's become such a point of obsession for me is because I realize it was a turning point in my life, knowing that I was constantly around global history and global stories. And I therefore felt connected with people. And it wasn't, I think there's oftentimes a narrative of like connecting in spite of one's differences versus that idea of creating a touch point, but also connecting because of one's differences, because there
Yes.
is this shared difference. And I think it's necessary and important to have that. But when we're looking at the way history is taught, if I know more about Napoleon Bonaparte at the age of 10 and the French conquest and then the English conquest and then history, then I can only imagine. It makes sense to me, sadly, why people come out not being able to relate to anyone except their own community. If you're of the dominant culture, you have not had to study anybody else, not
That's
seriously.
so true. I think that I I am so curious to know what you are going to do, what we will all do in this,
Yeah.
like how our the upcoming generations are going to learn about history. Because even like working with my, sorry, that's New York. With working on like my little siblings' homework and their social studies and their history homework, and you realize like, wow, this is what we were, and we were using the same textbooks. This is what we were taught, and this is why we are all going through this, like in Rachel Cargill's words, like the great unlearn, and just
Hmm.
peeling back layers. So what do you want people to know about what social justice really means and what making commitment really means so that they can see themselves in all of these movements?
Yeah. Well, I think social justice for me, I've always described it as a sense of indebted gratitude. When I think of the amount of work that has been done by generations prior for me to experience what I have been, whether it be the work that's directly been done by my grandfather, my grandparents, or people I've never met before.
Yeah.
Um, I often break down in my head, again, being a history nerd, the miracle of our existence, of the little things that had to
Yeah.
happen for you to be here on this planet. And so part of why I think social justice is mandatory in whatever form you choose to take it on is because it is a part of carrying on the chain of creating space for other people.
Mm.
Um, and then, just like you've said before, of the importance of seeing yourself connected in movements, there's many an entry point. If you don't feel naturally inclined to be of support for the sake of being of support, well, selfishly, you should be of
Exactly.
support because it affects you
Yeah.
directly. This idea that, I know they call it imminent critique, this idea of being able to be in a nation that says these are our values. Well, the least you can do as a citizen is that, like, you're not even standing up to these values as a nation. And therefore, that means that we haven't experienced these values. It means that these aren't the actual
Mm.
foundations or fabrics that we are built on. And it's important, I think, to see everyone as inherently interconnected for that very reason. Because, and I had gone on live before, um, just randomly last week, but one of the things that I'd been talking about is that if you are in a position where you're not of a certain community, you should look at a certain community's rights or lack of rights as a personal failure. And I don't mean that in any sense of blame, but I think really from a point of view of saying what they have access to or don't have access to is connected to the work I'm doing or not doing in terms of how I think or I'm not considering them. And so I feel as though I say all of that to say what I love most about social justice is that um, it is something that it can be so personalized and yet still so effective and so important, whether it be through your art and your storytelling, whether it be through, oh, you're in a science and STEM space, there's plenty of things to do there. There are racial biases to crack in how we code and in how we interface and how technology is made. There's so much to be done, which is overwhelming and so exciting because it means that there is a place for you, and
Mm,
it means that when you make it a daily practice, it will not feel like a chore because you do have to think about it with the stakes of their people's lives on the line. And so if I can make this daily commitment that ends up becoming seamlessly a part of my day, why not?
that's, yeah, I love that. And I think that that's a perfect note to end on because that is such a look like what a light and what a hope
Mm.
for all of us. And I'm so happy to see people choosing every day to make this commitment, knowing we are all going to make mistakes and knowing that there is a lifetime of things to learn. But like, what else is worth living for? That's
Right.
just keep coming back to. How can we support your work?
My work has really been in supporting other people's work right now. And so if you come to my page, I have just been doing, I think, what we've all been doing of turning to my mentors and people that have been leading this movement and sharing their resources. So if anything, I think what I've constantly turned to my audience to say is like, if there's an org that is of interest, if there's work that we may not have considered that is very cool, please share that with me. Just trying to use my platform to continue to share. And yeah, I think it's really just been about being able to be in community and be in conversation and try and point out the lifts that are super easy as well as the ones that may be a little heavier, but and everything in between to say that this is possible and there's action for all of us to take. So I've just been doing that on my page.
I mean, I love it's like the ultimate curation. I'm here for it. I love it.
Thank you.
And that's like the part of the ecosystem. Yara, thank you so much. I love
No,
you,
thank
you
you.
and your
Love you.
things. All my love to your family too. Thank
Yes, so
you.
much love to you.
Bye.
Bye.
That was Yara Shahidi, and that was at your service hour. Thank you so much for joining. Tomorrow's episode is going to be a special one as well. They're all special, but it will be with Tremaine Emery at Denim Tears. And we are going to be talking about using your influence to hold accountability, using your platform to hold accountability. So you've heard all of these brands and corporations and media outlets and everybody making all these commitments, but how do you use what you have to hold people accountable? So I'm excited to learn from him. And I'll post a little bit of homework and stuff on my story about that. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you so much. And as always, at your service. See you tomorrow, 12 p.m. Bye.